November 2nd, 1942. A German reconnaissance pilot sits in the cockpit of his Fieseler Storch, skimming over the desert near El Alamein. His Zeiss binoculars catch the shimmer of heat rising from the sands below. He sees exactly what he expects. Rows upon rows of British supply trucks, glinting in the morning sun, parked in neat, disciplined lines. He notes the coordinates, calls it in, and recommends headquarters save their shells. No armor, just transport. It's a routine observation, the sort of intelligence report he's written 100 times before. But what he's really looking at is one of the strangest and most successful battlefield illusions of the war. Within those truck parks sit more than 200 armored vehicles, Crusaders, Grants, and the newly arrived American Shermans, each hidden beneath a lightweight wooden frame covered in Hessian cloth and desert paste. From the air, they are indistinguishable from ordinary lorries. 3 hours later, the illusion dissolves. The wooden frames are ripped away, engines roar to life, and what had seemed like a logistics depot suddenly becomes a tidal wave of armor. The desert explodes into thunder as British tanks surge forward, catching the Afrika Korps completely off guard. The pilot's perfect report, logical, detailed, precise, has just doomed an entire defensive line. That day's deception wasn't luck. It was a product of months of experimentation, of soldiers and artists and engineers learning to weaponize perception. The device that fooled the Luftwaffe was called a Sunshield, a simple collapsible wooden cage that could turn a tank into a truck in less than 3 minutes. It shouldn't have worked once, not against the best optics in the world, not against observers trained to spot the difference between a tank's dust plume and a truck's. But it did, over and over again. And its success didn't come from technology or even craftsmanship. It came from something deeper, a profound understanding of how the human eye and the human mind can be led astray by its own certainty. The Sunshield's story began not in a laboratory, but in a theatre. The idea came from Britain's Camouflage Directorate, a mix of military engineers, artists, and stage magicians, led by Lieutenant Colonel Jasper Maskelyne, a professional illusionist-turned-officer. His job wasn't to hide objects perfectly, but to make them look convincingly ordinary. The early prototypes were crude, timber frames wrapped in burlap and painted in rough desert hues. But over months of trials, they became astonishingly precise. The final Mark I Sunshield was built from standardized 6-foot lengths of pine joined into a rectangular frame. 21 feet long, 8 wide, 7 high, exactly the size of a Bedford QL 3-ton truck. The fabric was coated in waterproof sand paint, and every inch mattered. Even the windows and cab shadows were painted on, mimicking the trucks seen daily in German reconnaissance photographs. It was a trick of proportion and psychology, not artistry. German pilots had spent 2 years staring at those same trucks. Their minds filled in the rest. When the order came to deploy, tank crews could strip off the disguise in seconds. 4 thumbscrews were released, 2 men grabbed the frame, and as the tank accelerated, the entire Sunshield collapsed backward and fell away like a discarded shell. Crews drilled it until they could perform the maneuver in the dark, under artillery fire, in less than 2.5 minutes. At first, tankers mocked it. "We look like a traveling circus," one wrote home. "Jerry will die laughing." But they stopped laughing when they realized it worked, and worked brilliantly. In Operation Crusader, 1941, British armor approached German lines disguised as truck convoys. When the attack began, the Germans were facing the wrong direction, defending against an assault that didn't exist. Within hours, Italian divisions were in retreat, their tanks shattered by an enemy they thought was still miles away. What the Germans never realized was that their defeat had begun days earlier, not with gunfire, but with a painted sheet of Hessian and a few planks of wood. By 1942, deception had become not just a tactic, but a weapon in its own right. The British had learned something vital. It wasn't enough to fool the eye. You had to fool the system. The Second Battle of El Alamein would prove the point. Operation Bertram, the deception plan for the offensive, remains one of the most extraordinary acts of large-scale misdirection ever attempted. In the weeks before the battle, the British had to move nearly 300 tanks north, right under the gaze of the Luftwaffe. To the Germans, the north was supposed to be quiet. the south bristling with armor. So the British reversed the picture. Each night, under blackout conditions, 50 tanks rolled north. Before dawn, each one disappeared beneath its sunshield, reappearing on reconnaissance photos as nothing more than a cluster of supply lorries. Meanwhile, in the south, actual trucks were disguised as tanks using the opposite device, nicknamed cannibals, wooden shells shaped like turrets and gun barrels, painted in dull khaki. From 2 a.m. to 5 a.m., the real armor moved. At 7 a.m. sharp, the Luftwaffe made its daily photo pass and saw exactly what it expected to see. Over 6 days, 6,000 tons of armor vanished from one part of the front and reappeared in another, and no one noticed. British wireless operators broadcast fake chatter to suggest armor was still in the south. Dummy fuel depots and empty water cans were left in plain view. Even the shadows were faked. Crews laid down false tire marks in the sand so that aerial analysts would see fresh supply routes. When the artillery opened fire on the night of October 23rd, the Africa Corps Command still believed the northern assault was a diversion. Their main reserves were positioned 20 miles away, guarding a phantom tank force that no longer existed. By dawn, Rommel's southern flank had collapsed. In his post-war memoir, a German intelligence officer wrote, "The British did not hide their tanks. They moved them before our eyes and made us believe we were watching something else. It wasn't just camouflage, it was choreography. The Sunshield's real weapon wasn't its wood or canvas, it was psychology." The British had discovered that deception didn't need to beat the human eye. It only needed to guide it. At 3,000 feet, through 40 degrees Celsius air, the shimmer of the desert bends light just enough to erase fine details. The eye can't resolve anything smaller than a couple of feet, meaning the track width of a tank, the subtle shadow of its turret, or the slight gleam of metal are all lost in distortion. What remains are shapes, familiar, comforting shapes, and the brain fills in the blanks. For German observers, that blank was always the same, a Bedford lorry. They'd seen thousands, and once they decided that's what they were looking at, the illusion became truth. After El Alamein, German intelligence finally examined captured sunshields. Their reports are almost admiring. "Primitive," one officer wrote, "but effective beyond 2 kilometers." They tried flying lower, changing flight paths, increasing patrols, but the desert was vast, the Luftwaffe short on fuel, and every lost reconnaissance plane meant one less fighter over the front. By 1943, 1,400 sunshields had been built and distributed across the 8th Army. American tank crews copied the design for their own units. It became doctrine, deception treated with the same seriousness as artillery or armor, and its lesson has outlived the Desert War itself. The British learned that the most powerful lies are those built from truths. They didn't invent new forms or colors, they borrowed the familiar and let the enemy's own expectations finish the illusion. In North Africa, tanks became trucks, and the impossible became routine. When that German pilot looked down over the desert in 1942, he wasn't blind. He saw what his training, his logic, and his experience all told him was there. And that's what made the deception perfect. The British didn't teach the desert to hide, they taught it to pretend. And that single insight, that belief can be more powerful than vision, changed the course of a war fought beneath a burning sun.